Negrified America, Julius Evola, translated by G.A. Malvicini, excerpted from The Bow and the Club, 1968, narrated by Skeptical Waves using an AI voice clone of Julius Evola. Not long ago, the newspapers announced that according to some calculations, by 1970 half of the population of Manhattan will be black, and that in the 5 boroughs that make up the entire city of New York, 28% of the inhabitants will be of colored race. Developments in the same direction have been registered in other cities and areas of the United States. We are witnessing a negrification, a mongrelization, and a decline of the white race in the face of faster breeding inferior races. Of course, from the point of view of democracy, there is nothing wrong with that. On the contrary, we are all acquainted with the zeal and intransigence of American proponents of so-called racial integration, which can only further speed the process. They not only advocate complete interracial social fraternization and want the Negro to have free access to any public and political office, so that we may even expect in the future a black president of the United States, but also have no objection to Negroes mixing their blood with that of white Americans. A characteristic example of propaganda for this agenda is the play entitled Deep Are the Roots, in other words, of racial prejudice, which Italian radio has felt the need to subject us to more than once. The integrationists who draw these conclusions, as logical as they are aberrant, from the dogma of egalitarian democracy, and who, while talking at full blast about freedom, are in fact advocating a truly coercive system, are still opposed, especially in the South, by certain groups that have no intention of giving a green light to the advance of the black race and the negrification of their country. However, these latter groups fail to realize the extent of the phenomenon, in the sense that they only notice it in its most material and tangible form. They fail to see the extent to which America is negrified, not only racially and demographically, but above all in its civilization, in the behavior and tastes of Americans, even when there has been no actual mixing with Negro blood. The U.S. has been compared, not without justification, to a melting pot. It actually presents us with a case in which a human type was formed with characteristics that are to a large extent uniform and constant, from out of a highly heterogeneous raw material. Immigrating to America, men of the most diverse peoples receive the same imprint after 2 generations. Except in rare cases, they lose almost all of their original characteristics, reproducing a fairly homogeneous unit in terms of mentality, sensibility, and behavior, the American type. In this regard, theories such as those formulated by Frobenius and Spengler, who have asserted that there is a close relationship between the forms of a given culture and a kind of soul, bound to the natural environment, to the landscape, and the original population, do not seem applicable. Otherwise, an essential part of American culture would have been possessed by the indigenous element, which consists of Amerindians, the Redskins. The Red Indians were proud races with their own style, their own dignity, sensibility, and forms of religiosity. Not without justification, a traditionalist writer, F. Schwann, spoke of the presence in their being of something aquiline and solar. And we will not hesitate to assert that had it been their spirit that to an appreciable extent had imbued in its best aspects and on an appropriate plane the human material thrown into the American melting pot, the level of American civilization would probably be higher. Instead, besides its Puritan Protestant component, which, in turn, as a result of its fetishistic emphasis on the Old Testament, possesses many Judaized, degenerate traits, it seems that it is precisely the Negro element, in its primitivism, that has set the tone in important aspects of the American psyche. It is already characteristic that when speaking of American folklore, it is to the Negroes one is referring, as if they were the original inhabitants of the country. Thus, the famous Porgy and Bess by the Jew Gershwin, which deals exclusively with blacks, is considered in the U.S. to be a classic work inspired by American folklore. The composer has declared that he lived for some time among American blacks in preparation for this work. But the phenomenon of popular and dance music is even more conspicuous and general. Fitzgerald was not wrong when he said that in one of its main aspects, American civilization can be called a civilization of jazz, i.e., of a negrified music and dance. In this domain, very singular elective affinities have led America, by way of a process of regression and primitivization, to imitate the Negroes. Assuming there would be a need for frenzied rhythms and forms as a legitimate compensation for the mechanical and materialistic soullessness of modern civilization, one would have done much better to look to the many sources available in Europe we have elsewhere mentioned, for example, the dance rhythms of southeastern Europe, which often have something truly Dionysian. But America has chosen to imitate the blacks and the Afro-Cubans, and then from America, the contagion has gradually spread to all other countries. The Negro component of the American psyche was already noticed in his time by the psychoanalyst C.G. Jung. A few of his observations are worth quoting. Another thing that struck me in the American was the great influence of the Negro, a psychological influence naturally, not due to the mixing of blood. The emotional way an American expresses himself, especially the way he laughs, can best be studied in the illustrated supplements of the American papers. The inimitable Teddy Roosevelt laugh is found in its primordial form in the American Negro. The peculiar walk with loose joints or the swinging of the hips so frequently observed in Americans also comes from the Negro. American music draws its main inspiration from the Negro, and so does the dance. The expression of religious feeling, the revival meetings, the holy rollers, and other abnormalities are strongly influenced by the Negro. The vivacity of the average American, which shows itself not only at baseball games, but quite particularly in his extraordinary love of talking. The ceaseless gabble of American papers is an eloquent example of this. He is scarcely to be derived from his Germanic forefathers, but is far more like the chattering of a Negro village. The almost total lack of privacy and the all-devouring mass sociability remind one of primitive life in open huts, where there is complete identity with all members of the tribe. The passage continues along the same lines, and Jung ends up wondering if the inhabitants of the new continent could still be considered to be Europeans. But his observations can be further developed. The brutality that unquestionably is a characteristic of Americans can well be said to have a Negro character. In the happy days of what Eisenhower was not ashamed to call the Crusade in Europe, as well as in the early days of the occupation, we had the occasion to observe the typical forms of that brutality. But we also saw that at times American whites went even farther in this respect than their Negro comrades, whose infantilism, however, they often shared. Generally speaking, the taste for brutality now seems to be ingrained in the American mindset. It is true that the most brutal of all sports, boxing, originated in England, but it is in the United States that its most aberrant forms have developed, and it is there that it has become the object of a collective obsession, soon transmitted to other nations. Concerning the taste for getting into fights and coming to blows in the most savage manner, it is enough, though, to consider the greater part of American films and popular detective stories. Vulgar fist-fighting is a constant theme, evidently because it corresponds to the tastes of American audiences and readers, for whom it seems to be the symbol of true masculinity. America, the world leader, has, on the other hand, more than any other nation, relegated the traditional duel to the status of ridiculous European antiquated rubbish. The duel is a method of settling disputes, following strict rules, without resorting to the primitive brute force of the mere arm and fist. There is no need to point out the striking contrast between this American trait and the ideal behavior of the English gentleman, despite the fact that the English made up a component of the original people of the United States. Modern Western man, to a large extent a regressive type, is in various respects comparable to a crustacean. He is as hard on the outside, as a man of action, as an unscrupulous entrepreneur, as an organizer, and so forth. as he is soft and formless in his internal substance. Now, this is true to the highest degree of Americans, who represent the degenerate Western type carried to the extreme. But here we find another of their affinities with the Negro: inconsistent sentimentality, banal pathos, especially in love affairs, put Americans much closer to Negros than to truly civilized Europeans. Of this, observers can easily find clear evidence in a number of typical American novels and again, songs, as well as in cinema and everyday life. That American eroticism is as pandemic as it is, technically speaking, primitive, has also been deplored by American girls and women, which brings us to yet another convergence with what is characteristic of the Negro races, in which the at times obsessive part always played by eroticism and sexuality is associated with primitivism. Thus, these races, unlike Orientals, the ancient Western world, and certain other peoples, have never known an ars amatoria worthy of the name. The much vaunted high sexual performance of Negroes is really only of a crudely quantitative priapic character. Another obvious aspect of American primitivism concerns the concept of bigness. Werner Sombart has successfully put his finger on it in saying that they mistake bigness for greatness. Now, this trait is not found in all non-European peoples or peoples of color. For example, an authentic Arab of the old race, a redskin, an East Asian, are not overly impressed by merely material, quantitative, ostentatious size, including that related to machinery, technology, and the economy. Apart, of course, from already Europeanized individuals, it is a trait found only in truly primitive and childish races like the Negro. It is no exaggeration to assert that the foolish pride of Americans in spectacular bigness in the achievements of their civilization reek of the Negro psyche. Here, we ought to mention the oft-repeated nonsense about Americans being a young race, with the tacit corollary that they are the race of the future. It is true that a myopic gaze easily mistakes regressive infantilism for true youth. Strictly speaking, according to the traditional conception, this perspective must be inverted. Despite appearances, recent peoples, since they came last, are the most removed from their origins, and as such must be considered to be the most senile and decadent peoples. This view, moreover, corresponds to the organic world. It explains how, paradoxically, the similarities of supposedly young peoples, in the above sense of latecomers, with genuinely primitive races that have remained outside of world history, and explains the taste for primitivism and the return to primitivism. We have already remarked upon the American predilection from an elective affinity for Negro and subtropical music, but the same phenomenon is apparent in other domains of more recent culture and art. We could consider, for example, the glorification of Negrified by existentialists, intellectuals, and progressive artists in France. It follows that Europeans, including the imitators of the higher non-European civilizations, demonstrate, in turn, the same primitive and provincial mentality when they admire America, when they let themselves be impressed by America, when they stupidly allow themselves to be Americanized and enthusiastically believe that this means catching up with the march of progress and that it is a sign of being liberated and open-minded. This catching up includes the social and cultural integration of the Negro, which is spreading in Europe itself and even in Italy, and promoted through the subliminal effects of imported films, where blacks and whites are shown mixing in social functions as judges, police officers, lawyers, etc., and television in spectacles showing black dancers and singers mixed up with white ones, so that the general public is gradually accustomed to interracial fraternization and loses every remaining natural sense of race and every feeling of distance. The hysteria caused by the shapeless, screaming mass of flesh that is the negress Ella Fitzgerald during her performances in Italy is a phenomenon that is as sad as it is indicative, as is the fact that the most blatant glorification of Negro culture, of negritude, comes from a German, Jan Hinz Jan, In a book published by Munti, a venerable old publishing house in Germany, the homeland of Aryan racism, a well-known left-wing Italian publisher, Inodi, was quick to spread it in our country as well, in a translation in 2 editions. This ranting book goes to the point of claiming that Negro culture would be an excellent means of reviving and restoring the materialistic civilization of the West. Regarding the elective affinities of Americans, we would like to refer to one more point. If in the United States of America there was one thing that seemed to be positive and present some sort of hope, it was the phenomenon of a new generation that had championed a kind of rebellious, anarchistic, nihilistic, and anti-conformist existentialism, the so-called Beat generation, the Beats, the hipsters and the like, which we will discuss more elsewhere. Well, fraternizing with blacks and a veritable religion of Negro jazz, deliberate race mixing, including white women having sexual relations with Negroes, are a characteristic aspect of this movement. In a well-known essay, Norman Mailer, who was one of its main exponents, actually established a kind of equivalence between the Negro and the human type of the generation in question, even defining the latter as a white Negro. Very rightly, Fausto Gianfranceschi has written in this regard. There is a parallel to the fascination exerted by Negro culture, in the terms described by Mailer, in the effect of the message of Friedrich Nietzsche at the turn of the century. The starting point is the same concern with shattering fossilized conformity through the immediate awareness of vital and existential facts. But what confusion, what degradation, if the Negro, as seen today with jazz and the sexual orgasm, is placed on the pedestal of the Superman. Pour la bonne douche, we will conclude with a significant statement by a far from superficial American author, James Burnham, in The Struggle for the World. There is in American life a strain of callow brutality. This betrays itself no less in the lynching and gangsterism at home than in the arrogance and hooliganism of soldiers or tourists abroad. The provincialism of the American mind expresses itself in a lack of sensitivity toward other peoples and other cultures. There is in many Americans an ignorant contempt for ideas and tradition and history, a complacency with the trifles of merely material triumph. Who, listening a few hours to the American radio, could repress a shudder if he thought that the price of survival of a non-communist society would be the Americanization of the world. And unfortunately, to a certain extent, this is already happening.